California's official earthquake hazard maps just got a real update. New and revised fault zone maps now cover Half Moon Bay, San Mateo County, and Santa Cruz County on the peninsula, along with Arcadia, Glendale, La Cañada Flint Ridge, Monrovia, Pasadena, Sierra Madre, and unincorporated Los Angeles County in the San Gabriel Valley. Separately, brand new hazard zone maps now cover Sacramento, West Sacramento, Santa Rosa, Sebastopol, Windsor, and 5 surrounding counties. If your property sits in any of those areas, the map covering your own backyard may look different today than it did a year ago. I want to walk you through exactly what changed, why it changed, and because I know that's the question in the title, whether any of this actually means the big one is getting closer. Short answer, not in the way you might think, but there's a real separate scientific story behind that question too, and I want to give you both halves of it, honestly. Let's get into it. First, let's talk about what actually happened here, because the map changed can mean a lot of different things. This is a specific technical kind of update. Back in November, the California Geological Survey released 2 distinct categories of official hazard maps. The first covers what are called Alquist-Priolo earthquake fault zones. These exist because of a law passed after the 1971 San Fernando earthquake, which produced real visible surface rupture, meaning the ground itself actually cracked and offset along the fault line, damaging and destroying buildings that happened to sit directly on top of it. That earthquake, a magnitude 6.6 that struck the northern San Fernando Valley, killed more than 60 people and caused catastrophic damage to structures built directly across the fault trace, including a hospital that partially collapsed. In response, California passed the Alquist-Priolo Act specifically to prevent that from happening again by requiring detailed geological investigation before anyone builds most types of structures directly across a mapped active fault trace. The new maps released in November add or revise these fault zones across Half Moon Bay, San Mateo County, Santa Cruz County, and that cluster of San Gabriel Valley cities I mentioned a moment ago. The second category is different, and it's worth understanding the distinction clearly. Seismic hazard zones, which is what got newly mapped for Sacramento, West Sacramento, Santa Rosa, Sebastopol, Windsor, and Sacramento, Yolo, Contra Costa, Alameda, and Sonoma counties, don't deal with surface fault rupture at all. They cover 2 separate hazards. Liquefaction, where water-saturated loose soil temporarily loses its strength and behaves almost like a liquid during strong shaking, and landslide risk, areas where a slope could fail during an earthquake even if it's nowhere near an actual fault line. Both of these are genuinely serious hazards in their own right, capable of causing severe structural damage even at some distance from where an earthquake's rupture actually occurs. But they're a completely different physical phenomenon than a fault literally tearing the ground apart, which is what the Alquist-Priolo zones are specifically designed to address. Liquefaction in particular has a well-documented history of causing damage far from where an earthquake's fault rupture actually happened. During the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, whose epicenter was down near Santa Cruz in the mountains, San Francisco's Marina District, built partly on loose fill material from decades earlier, experienced significant liquefaction and some of the most severe building damage anywhere in the entire Bay Area that day, despite sitting many miles from where the fault actually ruptured. That's exactly why seismic hazard zone mapping matters as its own separate category. A community can face a genuinely serious earthquake risk even without a mapped active fault running directly underneath it, simply because of what kind of soil happens to sit beneath the surface. It's worth zooming out for a second to the national picture too, since California's mapping effort is actually part of a much larger, ongoing federal project. The USGS periodically updates a national seismic hazard model covering the entire country, and its most recent major update was the first version to ever include all 50 states in a single unified assessment, finding that nearly 75% of the country carries some risk of a potentially damaging earthquake within the next 100 years. Mark Peterson, the USGS geophysicist who led that mapping effort, explained that updates like this get refined over time simply because the underlying science keeps improving, with better data on local soil conditions and how they modify shaking at a given site, and more detailed understanding of exactly how complex fault ruptures actually behave. That update highlighted risk in some genuinely less expected places too, including a section of the central United States carrying the same top-tier risk color as California and Alaska, and Charleston, South Carolina, still carrying a documented elevated risk tied to a major earthquake that struck there back in 1886. It's the same underlying principle as California's own state-level map updates. Better science revealing a more accurate picture of hazards that were already there, not new danger appearing out of nowhere. So why did these specific maps just get released now in these specific places? This is the part I really want you to understand because it directly answers is the big one getting closer question, just not in the way the title might initially suggest. These maps didn't change because the underlying earthquake hazard in Half Moon Bay or Sacramento suddenly increased. They changed because California Geological Survey geologists completed new, detailed field investigations in these specific areas. Trenching studies that physically dig across a suspected fault trace to examine the layers of soil and rock for evidence of past rupture. LiDAR-based topographic analysis capable of revealing subtle ground features that are invisible from the surface but show up clearly once vegetation and structures are digitally stripped away from elevation data, and careful review of existing geological literature and records. This is slow, systematic, ongoing work that the state has been doing for decades, one region at a time, gradually building out a more complete and more precise picture of hazards that were physically already there, just not yet formally documented and regulated. If your property just landed inside a newly mapped fault zone, the fault didn't move into your neighborhood. The state's understanding of exactly where that fault already sits finally caught up to reality. That distinction matters enormously for how you should actually interpret a headline like California's earthquake map just changed. It's the same basic principle as historical earthquake catalogs getting revised as researchers dig up better historical records, or a live earthquake's depth estimate getting refined hours after it happens, as more seismic station data comes in. New information. Sharpening an existing picture is not the same thing as new danger appearing out of nowhere, and conflating the two is one of the most common ways earthquake news ends up sounding scarier than the actual underlying science supports. Now, if you happen to live in one of these newly mapped areas, I do want to be clear about what this actually means practically, because it's not purely academic. If your property now sits within an Alquist-Priolo earthquake fault zone, that generally means any new construction of most habitable structures on that parcel will require a site-specific geological investigation to locate the exact fault trace and maintain an appropriate setback from it before a permit gets approved. If you're in a newly mapped seismic hazard zone for liquefaction or landslide risk, similar additional geotechnical review requirements typically apply for new development. This can matter for real estate transactions too, since sellers in California are generally required to disclose whether a property sits within one of these mapped zones. If you want to check your own address directly rather than wondering, California has a public tool called EQZAP, the California Earthquake Hazards Zone Application, that lets you type in any address and see exactly which mapped zones, if any, apply to that specific parcel. I want to be clear that none of this retroactively applies to homes that were already built before a zone was mapped. If you own an existing house that now falls inside one of these newly designated areas, you're not suddenly required to retrofit or relocate. The requirements primarily kick in around new construction, major additions, and certain types of substantial remodeling, which is exactly why the disclosure requirement during a home sale matters so much. It's often the point where a buyer first learns their prospective property sits inside a mapped hazard zone and where that knowledge can reasonably factor into decisions about additional geotechnical inspection or insurance coverage, even for a property that isn't currently subject to any new building restriction. While we're on the subject of practical tools, it's worth mentioning Shake Alert, the West Coast's earthquake early warning system, since it's a genuinely separate but complementary piece of California's overall earthquake safety infrastructure from the hazard maps I've been walking through. Rather than predicting where or when an earthquake will happen, Shake Alert detects the very first, faster-traveling seismic waves the instant an earthquake actually begins, and uses the few seconds before the slower, more destructive shaking waves arrive at a given location to push an automated alert to phones, transit systems, and infrastructure operators. It won't give you enough time to evacuate a building, but it can be enough time to drop, cover, and hold on before the worst shaking hits. And it's worth confirming it's actually enabled on your phone rather than assuming it's on by default. So that's the literal map update. Now let's get into the real, separate scientific question the title is actually gesturing at, because there is a genuinely serious, ongoing body of research about California's major faults that's worth understanding on its own terms. The USGS maintains something called the Uniform California Earthquake Rupture Forecast, currently in its third major version, often referred to as UCERF3. This is a comprehensive probabilistic model covering essentially every mapped fault capable of producing a significant earthquake across the state, and it's the scientific foundation behind the statewide earthquake probability figures you'll sometimes see cited in the news. Looking forward across the 30-year window from 2026 to 2056, the model puts the probability of a major rupture on some of California's most closely watched fault segments at around 33%, which works out to roughly a 1.3% chance in any single given year. I want to walk through what that actually means, because raw percentages like this get misunderstood constantly. A 33% chance over 30 years doesn't mean scientists expect it to happen exactly once every 90 years like a fixed timer. It means that, based on everything currently known about how frequently that specific fault segment has ruptured in the geologic past and how much stress has accumulated since its last rupture, there's roughly a 1 in 3 chance of a qualifying earthquake occurring somewhere along that segment within the next 3 decades. It's a genuine, serious probability, but it's a statistical statement about likelihood, not a countdown clock ticking toward a specific date. Let's talk about scale for a second, because I think it's easy to lose track of just how much is actually at stake across California as a whole. Current hazard modeling estimates that roughly 16 million people and about $3 trillion in building value site within zones classified as extreme seismic hazard, meaning areas where peak ground acceleration, essentially a measurement of how violently the ground itself would accelerate back and forth during a major earthquake, expressed as a percentage of the normal pull of gravity, could exceed 50% of that gravitational value during a design basis earthquake for that location. To put a number on what a full scale event might actually look like, planning scenarios built around a magnitude 7.8 or larger rupture along the southern San Andreas project, something in the range of 1,800 deaths, 50,000 injuries, $200 billion in direct damage, and roughly 500,000 people displaced from their homes. I want to be clear that figures like these come from structured emergency planning scenarios, the same kind of exercise behind large-scale preparedness drills like the annual Great Shakeout, not from anyone claiming to know exactly what will happen or when. Their purpose is to give emergency planners, hospitals, and infrastructure operators a concrete, physically grounded scenario to actually plan and train against, rather than a vague, unquantified sense that a big earthquake would be bad. So, pulling this all together, did California's earthquake map just change because the big one is getting closer? No, not directly. The specific maps released in November reflect refined geological knowledge in particular communities, the result of years of careful field work, not a sudden shift in underlying risk. But is there a real, ongoing, entirely separate scientific story about major California faults carrying historically high stress and running up against or past their typical recurrence intervals? Yes, genuinely. And that story deserves attention on its own terms, rather than being artificially bundled with a routine regulatory map update just because they both involve the word earthquake. Here's what I'd actually encourage you to do with all of this. If you live anywhere in California, take a few minutes to check your own address on EQ's app, regardless of whether you've heard your specific neighborhood mentioned in earthquake news recently, since a huge amount of the state's mapped hazard zones cover areas that never make headlines at all. If you're a homeowner, remember that standard homeowners insurance in California typically does not cover earthquake damage, and a policy through the California Earthquake Authority or a private insurer is worth genuinely evaluating rather than assuming you're covered. If you're in an older building, particularly one built from unreinforced masonry, which remains one of the most consistently dangerous building types in any major earthquake, regardless of exactly which fault ruptures, look into whether your city has a mandatory retrofit program and where your specific building stands in that process. And regardless of any of that, know the basics. Drop, cover, and hold on the moment you feel strong shaking. Know the safest spot in your home and workplace in advance, and consider participating in the Great Shakeout drill that runs every October, since practicing the response costs you almost nothing, and could matter enormously if you're ever using it for real. It's also worth having a basic household emergency plan that goes beyond just the moment of shaking itself. A major California earthquake, especially anything approaching the scenario I described earlier, could reasonably disrupt water, power, and cell service across a wide area for days, not hours. A basic kit with water, non-perishable food, any essential medications, a flashlight, and a battery-powered or hand-crank radio is worth having assembled before you need it, along with a plan for how your household would communicate if local phone networks got overloaded, since it's often easier to get a call through to someone out of the immediate area than to someone just a few miles away in the same disaster zone. None of this requires believing a major earthquake is imminent to be worth doing. It requires accepting that you live somewhere this is a genuine, well-documented possibility, which is true for most of California regardless of how close or far any individual fault's next rupture actually turns out to be. I also want to leave you with a broader way of thinking about stories like this one, because I suspect it won't be the last "the map changed" headline you see about California earthquakes. Anytime you see a story like this, it's worth asking two separate questions rather than treating them as one. Did the actual underlying hazard change? Meaning, did a fault move? Did stress accumulate faster than expected? Did new seismic activity emerge somewhere new? Or did our knowledge and documentation of an existing, already present hazard simply improve? Sometimes the honest answer is genuinely the first one, and that deserves real attention. But a lot of the time, especially with routine regulatory map updates like November's release, the honest answer is the second one. And understanding that difference is exactly what separates a well-informed reaction from an unnecessarily alarmed one. That distinction doesn't mean the underlying risk isn't real. And I don't want this video to land as dismissive of California's genuine earthquake hazard, because it's entirely real, well documented, and worth taking seriously on its own merits. It just means the specific map update that prompted this video is best understood as an improvement in precision, layered on top of a much longer-running, separately tracked scientific conversation about fault stress and recurrence intervals, rather than as fresh evidence that something has suddenly shifted underground. Both stories are worth knowing. They're just not the same story, even when a headline compresses them into one sentence. I'll keep tracking both halves of this going forward. Any further updates to California's official hazard maps as the state continues its methodical mapping work in new regions, and the deeper scientific research into the state's most heavily stressed fault systems, since I expect more of that kind of study to keep coming out, given how much serious research attention this specific question continues to receive. If anything genuinely changes the picture I've given you today, I'll bring you an update grounded in what the actual research says, not in how dramatic a headline can be made to sound. Stay informed, check your own risk directly rather than relying on secondhand summaries, and I'll see you in the next one.